Welcome to the Spaces Net Carbon Zero podcast. I'm Alex G. As part of the Spaces Year of Net Carbon Zero events, we are going to be talking to 4 leading thinkers and practitioners, finding out just how they found themselves in this field, why the work they do is so important, and fundamentally, what do we need to do to support the drive to net carbon zero? Today, we're talking to Dr. Shaun Fitzgerald, Director of Research at the Centre for Climate Repair at Cambridge. Shaun, you're a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, working at the interface of academic research, business, government policy, and public engagement. You've worked extensively in the commercialization of new intellectual property arising from university research and supported the UK government in rewriting policy documents for building standards. Prior to joining the Centre for Climate Repair, you were the director of the Royal Institution, overseeing the programme for engaging the public with science and engineering. Dr. Shaun Fitzgerald, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, very nice to be with you.
And thank you for joining us. And there's a really, I was looking at the introduction and thinking that point about engaging public with science and engineering, there's this sort of golden triangle there, isn't there, in terms of carbon zero and our approach to that, which is around how we bring people in that don't understand or don't have the knowledge and don't have the scientific or sort of rigorous engineering background, and how do we educate them, and how do we bring forward the sort of government initiatives to weave this whole thing together? And I'm wondering, in your role, is that how do you bridge that?
So my experience has been, as you laid out, sort of looking at different ways of basically tackling this problem of carbon, and for some unknown reason, I got the bug, when I'm going to show my age here now, in the late 80s, when I was an undergraduate, and we were using energy, lots of coal, oil, and gas to provide energy for society, and I just felt that this was wrong, because even then, back then, the carbon emissions, I just knew that this was not the right thing to do for the long haul, that there had to be a better way in order to tackle the impact that we were then even having on the environment. So being in a university environment, I got sort of hooked on the idea of looking at research, and actually I did some research on green energy supply. I ran the faculty on geothermal reservoir engineering at Stanford in the early part of my career, so I was doing geothermal reservoir engineering, and then more latterly looking at how do you use less energy in the first place, which was going to very related to energy efficient buildings, and looking at how do you reduce energy consumption, in particular with HVAC systems. But back to the question as to why I think this is really important. Doing academic research in and of itself is necessary but not sufficient to tackle this problem. And when I was in the university developing ideas about energy efficient buildings, we then formed a company called Breathing Buildings as a spin out, and we went through multiple rounds of venture capital, and it's now actually part of a larger company, Volution Limited. But that journey was incredibly important because we set up the company really to try and help change the industry. That was the objective, right? That was why we set up this business. And it taught me a huge amount regarding engaging with basically customers. But we were having a problem at the beginning because we were selling trying to sell equipment for which there was no market. In other words, we weren't going into an existing market where they knew about hybrid ventilation, they knew about mixing. Now we had to go and create it from scratch. And there's a great parallel with, therefore, working with other stakeholders as to how do you go and help people. And you mentioned education, but it's not just educating sort of people. It's about sharing and learning from people. So this is what we learned from potential customers as to actually what they wanted, and therefore we spend a lot of time selling. Is very important. That somebody in my team at Breathing Buildings, not necessarily very sophisticated person, but my gosh, I had a great deal to learn from him. And he said, we were given 2 ears and 1 mouth in that ratio for a good reason, Shaun. And that, when you're out with customers, this is what we need to be doing. We need to be listening to people. And therefore, actually, this is how we really, really engage, by thinking about the concerns that people have about the environment, and therefore sharing and discussing options. And it's only by being one with people in terms of whether it's the public, whether it's your customers, that actually you then really start to build a consensus and momentum. And it takes a bit longer, but it becomes a much surer way of progressing society, where actually society has a lot to teach you, even if you're just an academic. You've got some great ideas. That's perhaps only 10% of what's necessary. The rest of it is actually think about everything else, but with whether it's a successful company or a successful endeavor.
And I suppose part of the bringing that back to sort of today's challenge and the global challenge that we're facing on this is that actually there's a deadline, and at some point when do we move from the I suppose the listening and the engagement piece and understanding what that requirement is, to then be able to determine a solution that's going to meet that demand, and then a sort of more global target to say, actually, guys, irrespective of whether there's a solution, whether there's a market, whether there's demand, actually we need a solution for this slightly larger, for this much larger global problem that we have to tackle and we have to face. Where do those two things rub together, or don't they?
They do rub together, but the listening never stops. So it's an evolution. So actually, and therefore the doing starts fairly early as well. So for example, when it comes to figuring out what the right ventilation option is for a given building suite, then actually you go and do the listening and then start trying to help people by either developing products or actually getting sort of evolutions in the building codes to sort of say, look, these are some of the learnings that we've had. This is why we'd like them changed. But the great thing is that those building codes, for example, yes, they've got they're really, really important, but thank goodness that they're only written with a certain shelf life, because they will then get reviewed. Let's say it's in 5 years' time, and that's very, very important, because in the following 5 years, you may well be learning about areas where actually those ideas are no longer the best in class. There may be other technologies that come to play. So, for example, in the world of ventilation, if somebody is able to devise in our area really, really efficient heat exchangers, then actually it changes the tipping point of where sort of mechanical ventilation with heat recovery plays in the UK environment. And therefore, that might be an important contributing factor in this current last 12 months where we've had the issues to do with COVID. And therefore, even just looking at the amount of air that we should be providing people, that's a really important ingredient, because it changes the tipping point of when, for example, a mixing ventilation system becomes the ideal solution, rather than mechanical ventilation with heat recovery. You put these two into the mix, and in fact, that needs to be written into the codes in, say, 5 years' time, when we think about, right, what are the appropriate air quality levels that we should be targeting within schools in order to make them more resilient to cope with pandemics. We haven't done that before. So we listen and we evolve, but that doesn't stop us from actually trying to do something in the near term.
That's really interesting, isn't it? And the pandemic has thrown up a whole range of different challenges that we're going to have to consider in terms of how we use our public spaces, whether they're schools, whether they're civic buildings, whether they're other sort of spaces that we occupy, around what those levels of tolerance are within the mechanical electrical systems that we have. Because will we get back to a time where you can free flow around a building with as many people as you like in it, or to the maximum capacity of the building, or might we now have to start mitigating numbers in spaces for the next 24, 36 months, possibly longer, and actually what does that do? What strain or otherwise does that put on those systems?
So that's a really good question, and I think one needs to look at it in the round, because clearly there are benefits, societal benefits, even just your enjoyment at work, being able to sort of mix with people, and the way that you work. I think it's unlikely that we will just go back to the way that we used to work, but not because it's all about COVID. It's actually what we've learned about what we should be doing to improve well-being in the last 12 months. So it's not all been negative. So for example, just how rigid should we be regarding turning up to work in an office 5 days a week, working, I don't know, 8:30 to 5:30? Actually, is that right? Should we be looking at well-being where there's a bit more flexibility regarding where you work 1 day a week, 2 days a week, or whatever that is? So you improve the lifestyle, the well-being of employees, but of course that's then also reducing the stress on your building, on your public buildings, in terms of the number of people that might be working there or visiting there, and therefore there can be co-benefits. So I think there are some significant lessons to learn about what we've had to do to adapt to coping with COVID, to then go forwards, which might actually put us in an even better place, as well as thinking about actually how do we go and prepare for the next pandemic, Alex, because this has just been a wake-up call, really. We won't be the last.
That's a really interesting point. And I suppose you've sort of led me nicely into my next question, which is around the experiences that you've had to date in the various guises of your journey. What do you think is the most important lesson you've learned along the way?
I think I've learned two lessons, Alex, but they are related. And the first is that the success of whatever you're trying to do is in very, very large part all about your team. All right. In other words, making sure that you've got a team that functions, and it's not just an individual effort, because a well-functioning team. You've got five people working together do a lot more than five people working individually. So it is, very, very large part about the team. The second lesson, and this is something I learned from some very wise people that I was working with in the late 90s, was that if you're in the position of assembling the team, you assemble the very brightest and best people to work with you, even if they are you're worried about, oh gosh, they're so much better than me, therefore I can't be the leader. What you should really focus on and be worried about is the cause, not your role. And in other words, if this is what you care about, you surround yourself with the brightest and best. Now, the reality is, if that's your view, that it's all about the cause, you're very likely to be the person that's going to be the person that's best suited to be leading the team, even if you're not necessarily the most competent in certain areas. But you just want to surround yourself with the brightest and best. And I have had the joyous experience of working with some ridiculously bright people and energized people where we have common values. So those are the two lessons I would say it's about working with people. And I'm enjoying my current role at the University of Cambridge, being surrounded by, one might say scarily bright, but I'm not scared. I'm just in awe and I'm enjoying it greatly.
Great stuff and fantastic lessons to learn and something for us all to take away there. Coming back to the challenge and net carbon zero, and from an engineering perspective, there seem to be so many different emerging engineering solutions. As you rightly say, the science and the academics will look at a scenario, play that out, create a solution for it. Shortly after, some technology becomes available that flips that on its head, and there's a different engineering solution that presents itself. So how do we know what's best?
So killer question about sort of being able to figure out the options, which one should you be following. And this is where another sort of thing that I've learned about how to sort of be successful, and it's to be an informed buyer. Interestingly, it was a gentleman who used to work for ASDA that taught me this lesson, and he was an amazing mechanical consulting engineer who I had great respect for. And he had this role where he was overseeing the engineering design of new stores. And he was sufficiently competent that he could do, easily sufficiently competent, he could have done the work that he was asking of his engineering consultants that he was hiring to go and do the design, let's say, of a store. But he was doing like 10, and therefore he couldn't afford the time to go and do all the gory details of one of those stores, but he knew enough about how stores were done that he could oversee that work and know when things weren't going right, or actually, have you thought about these options? No, that framework for developing your options isn't correct. He was sufficiently well equipped that was able to effectively buy the services and of people providing him with advice. And this is, I think, sort of a sanguine lesson for us all, is that if you're, for example, commissioning a building, which is going to be designed, and somebody and you're not an engineering expert, for example, and you've hired an engineering expert to provide you with the design, and you're paying them for the design of the work, there is value in having that work approved or reviewed by somebody else if you're not able to review it because you don't have the technical expertise yourself. And in a very early part of my career, this is how it worked in the geothermal industry. When a developer wanted to go and get a loan from a bank to finance the whole growth of a new installation, the developer would hire an engineering consulting firm to go and develop the whole scheme. And then they would go and present that information to the bank. And the bank would then go and hire their own engineering team to go and review the work of this other engineering consulting firm that had been appointed by the developer. As it turns out, the developer then paid for both services through the rate at which they were going to be borrowing money from the bank. But this was all about being an intelligent, informed purchaser. And that's what we can do, because you're right, things are developing. It's pretty quick out there. And if you don't feel that, gosh, am I able to really make this decision, and you're being advised by, whether it's a salesperson, whether it's by the engineering consultant that you've appointed, if you've got any concerns whatsoever, then just appointing somebody else to go and do that review and help you is very, very important.
There's a lesson there, certainly for the public sector, to have that technical client side intelligence to help them understand the outcomes that are going to be achieved from the consultants they're working with. So the consultants will come up with a proposal, come up with a solution, and very often, from the public sector perspective, just having, as you rightly say, just having that intelligent client side response to be able to assess that proposal and say, yes, that is going to meet our objectives, is absolutely key.
And I would say the business model as to whether you actually employ somebody to ensure that you've got the intelligent, informed client side. If you're doing enough procurement, then it would probably make sense for you to have that team employed by yourself. But if you're only sort of procuring the occasional building, then that wouldn't make sense. It would be more cost effective to not employ people full time, but to actually just buy the services in on an as needs basis. And it really just depends on the scale of the organization and the amount of procurement, therefore, that organization is overseeing.
That's a good point, and one I think certainly from my experience working across public sector organizations, they do that a lot. And I suppose there's a challenge in that, which is around the consistency of that advice and how strong that advice is to enable them to say, on this scheme, you're going to achieve the benefits. On this scheme, might be something very different, might be much smaller. And are you going to get the same benefits or same relatable benefits from those schemes? And I suppose in public sector, we tend to do lots of procurement, and we go out to, we have set criteria in which we're evaluating something, but actually there's a consistency of understanding what our requirements are and our own value objectives that we're trying to achieve, and have an organization or a couple of organizations that really understand that and run alongside us, rather than just commission, you're here to do a job, do that job, move, and we spread the love across half a dozen different consulting organizations that sit there and give us that intelligent client function, but not necessarily with the holistic view that we're trying to get to with an outcome such as net carbon zero on our public buildings, for example. So it's a really, really good point. I suppose, as custodians of public spaces, is there anything you would suggest we need to do differently to actively achieve our carbon net zero objectives by 2030? And I suppose a supplementary question, is 2030 achievable?
So there are two things. The first is probably the easy one, is that when you're looking at a new building, making sure that you have commissioned sort of a good team that's aware of new technology and clearly understands the risks of using new technology. So ideally, you don't want it mega new. You just want it to be sufficiently new that sort of it's got some experience, and therefore any teething problems have been ironed out. So just making sure you've got a team that's on the case, reviewing the literature, making sure that they're aware of that. That's with new buildings. With buildings that you already have, there are two things with those. The first one is actually rather boring, but ridiculously important, and that is just making sure they're well maintained. All right, and I know it's not an exciting message, Alex, but actually the maintenance programs for buildings to make sure, for example, that the windows are openable if they're supposed to be opening windows to help with things like COVID, but it will also help with making sure that you are ventilating the space at night, in the summer to make them cooler, therefore you're using less air conditioning. So just regular building maintenance is really, really important. And then, of course, if you're going to do some major overhaul work, refurbishment work, making sure that you do think very hard about the investment in the building, because these things are not things that you do lightly, and it's the decadal timescales that we're looking at, and making sure that you go deep, making sure that the refurbishment is going to make looking at the technologies that are available, so that you can avail yourselves of zero carbon opportunities. And it doesn't mean penny pinching. It means, right, we're going to do a refurbishment of this space. We're going to do this really properly. So it's being sort of thinking futuristically about this, and we are investing not just for ourselves. My age, if I was doing a refurbishment project, the people that we're going to really see the benefit if I do an awesome job are people probably after I've retired. All right, we've got to have this visibility about thinking about 20 years time. I'd like this building to still be amazing. That's the kind of sort of mentality that I'd like to have in the refurbishment space.
And my supplementary question: is 2030 achievable?
2030 for a building, it depends on actually the scale at which we could really refurbish our buildings, right? So let's say it's 2021 now, 9 years time. We're not going to do everything through the energy efficiency measures, Alex. We just can't. But we can get there through, in large part, certainly by reducing the emissions, not getting to zero, but serious reductions. There are two things. The easy ones are making sure that we're buying electricity from those that are providing electricity in a fossil-free way. So that's looking at your suppliers. But the really big question is, that was easy. What about the other energy source that we use, which is either oil and gas, often, not always, for heating? And therefore, gosh, are we able to look at how do we do that properly? And right now, there are no scalable options to go and have oil and gas from coming into your facility in a zero carbon way. In the future, there may be even methane. The reason being is that you might think, well, come on, Shaun, how are you going to get a zero carbon methane? Zero carbon methane could be generated in the future by carbon dioxide captured from the air, and then actually that then going through a process where you make methane by adding it with hydrogens, which is split from water, just as a convenient fuel source. Is now just a vector, and then it becomes zero carbon because the carbon itself has come recently from the atmosphere, not from a fossil fuel. But I think we're a long way from that, and therefore the more likely trajectory is that we need to be looking at the use of heat pumps, and because then you can use electricity for your heating as well. But heat pumps are not necessarily easy in certain buildings, because to get the maximum thermodynamic efficiency from those, you typically need larger heat emitters, and therefore if you've got places which have only got limited wall space and they've already been maxed out in terms of radiator size, it's going to be challenging. So therefore, as part of a refurbishment project, you're going to be looking to try and insulate the space and then looking at the heat pumps. So it comes back to insulate first, figuring out how do I go and get me to the zero carbon second. But say that those are big challenges for the existing building stock.
And I suppose because they're existing buildings, there's no one sort of there's no one easy fit. There's no one great retrofit. I mean, you can passive house various things, but there's no one great retrofit that you can apply to all of your school stock if you're a local authority and say, right, there's our model, there's our template, off we go.
No, because we have such a varied suite of buildings. I mean, going forwards, I would you might not like it architecturally, but it would be very much easier to think about maintenance and cost effectiveness if we were to have more standardized buildings, modular buildings. And I think that it's been sort of talked about a lot, and it's made some progress, but it's certainly not at the scale that I think we really need to be able to really then have an existing building stock in, say, 2040, where we've spent the last 20 years building standardized buildings. And then, of course, the maintenance for those would then be pretty similar. But more importantly, any refurbishment options that we're looking at in 20, 30 years' time for those buildings, we could then roll out at scale. And we would then have, right, for this suite of buildings, Alex, we can then, whether it's changing the windows, whether it's changing the insulation on the walls, whether it's changing the heat source, we would then have something at scale that we could then go and deploy. And that's something that really should be featuring in our thinking now.
I think the future projection looks promising. I think that the fact that we're thinking about these things and designing these things in now is going to have massive advantages and benefits further down the line for us, for my children, for their children. So hopefully we're designing in a sustainable future, even though we haven't necessarily previously designed one already. So going forward should be fine. Shaun, just for our audience, I mean, is there one sort of piece of literature, article, documentary that you would want them to have a look at that would totally revolutionize their thinking around this subject?
There isn't one piece, okay, that I would point to, Alex. But what I would encourage people to do is, firstly, just to enjoy actually just ongoing, research, ongoing reviews, reading articles about what's coming down the tracks. But because these are opportunities we should all be aware of. But I come back to something I said earlier, which is being able to decide and judge, what is the right option, for example, for my next refurbishment project or my next procurement project for a new building within a public space. It's actually making sure that we've got the right expertise within your team, or you hire some help to go and make sure that, because the knowledge base that's required to really inform those decisions, Alex, is more than just reading, a given journal article or watching a video series, or even just a single video. It's accumulated knowledge from many, many years.
Dr. Shaun Fitzgerald, thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast, and we look forward to seeing you at the roundtable discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.